There's a moment quiet, unannounced, when regret finally speaks, not loud, not dramatic. It arrives when the noise is gone and life slows down, just enough for truth to catch up. That's the moment he realizes you weren't just someone who loved him. You were someone rare, someone he thought would always be there, and now you're not. This isn't about revenge, it's about clarity. About the exact moment a man understands that a woman like you wasn't replaceable. She was once in a lifetime. It doesn't happen the day you walk away. That day, he thinks he's fine, maybe even relieved. He tells himself it was for the best, that things had grown heavy, that freedom feels lighter. He doesn't chase the silence yet, because silence still feels temporary. In his mind, you're not gone, you're just somewhere else, still reachable, still emotionally available, still a familiar presence he can tap into whenever he chooses. That's the illusion. At first, he mistakes distance for space. He assumes time will soften you, that your emotions will circle back the way they always did. He's used to your patience, used to your understanding, used to the way you stayed even when things were unclear, even when effort was uneven. So when you leave, he doesn't feel loss. He feels pause. He still has access to your kindness, access to your empathy, access to the version of you that explained instead of walked away. He sends a message weeks later, something casual, something safe, maybe even something nostalgic, and you respond, but not the way you used to. The warmth is thinner. The availability is shorter. You're polite, but not present. That's when confusion creeps in, quiet but sharp. Because this is unfamiliar. Psychologists talk about something called perceived availability, the belief that someone will always be emotionally reachable. Studies show that people don't experience true loss when a relationship ends. They experience it when that perceived availability disappears. When the emotional door closes, not just the physical one, that's when his nervous system reacts, not before. He doesn't miss you when you leave the room. He misses you when the room no longer exists. Days pass, maybe months, and he realizes he can't access you the way he once did. You're no longer updating him on your life. You're no longer asking his opinion. You're no longer waiting for his replies. The small invisible privileges he once had, your attention, your emotional labor, your presence, are gone. And that's when it hits, not like a wave, more like a drop in the stomach, a slow, sinking recognition. He starts to notice the absence in ordinary moments. When something good happens, and there's no one to tell who truly understands. When something goes wrong, and there's no one who knows how to calm him without judgment. When he reaches for his phone out of habit and realizes there's nothing to say anymore that wouldn't feel intrusive. You've changed roles, from constant to distant, from safe place to closed chapter, and that shift shakes him. Real life patterns back this up. Surveys of post-breakup regret consistently show that men report the strongest emotional impact not immediately after a breakup, but months later, when their former partner stops responding the same way, stops engaging emotionally, stops being available as a backup source of comfort. That delayed reaction isn't indifference, it's entitlement dissolving. He was never prepared for the idea that access to you was a privilege, not a guarantee. He remembers how you used to show up without being asked, how you listened even when he didn't have the right words, how you made space for his moods, his stress, his uncertainty. At the time, it felt normal, expected, almost invisible. Now it's gone and its absence is loud. He realizes something uncomfortable. He didn't lose you when you left. He lost you when you stopped needing to be understood by him. That's when memory starts to rewrite itself. Moments he once overlooked now replay with weight. Your patience wasn't weakness. Your forgiveness wasn't endless. Your presence wasn't permanent. It was chosen. And he didn't choose it back. There's a moment when he tries to re-enter your world, not dramatically, not desperately, but cautiously. He tests the waters, a compliment, a question, an apology that doesn't fully name the harm, and you don't bite. Not because you're cold, but because you're done explaining. That's when reality lands. You're not holding space anymore. You're holding boundaries. He can feel it in the way conversations end quickly, in the way you don't linger, in the way your life seems full without him in it. There's no anger to argue with, no emotion to manage, just distance, calm, finality. And that calm terrifies him, because anger would mean you still care. Silence means you've moved on. Attachment research shows that the human brain registers emotional unavailability as a threat far more intensely than rejection. Rejection is clear. Unavailability is destabilizing. It forces reflection, it removes leverage. He can't bargain with silence. He can't negotiate with indifference. That's when the regret becomes real. He understands that while he was deciding whether you were the one, you were deciding whether staying was costing you yourself. While he assumed you'd wait, you were learning to walk away. While he delayed, you detached. And detachment is irreversible once it's complete. He starts to notice how rare your presence was, not in grand gestures, but in consistency. You weren't dramatic, you weren't chaotic, you didn't play games, you showed up. And now, without that steady energy, his life feels louder, more unstable, less anchored. He meets other people, talks to them, spends time with them. But something's off. They don't offer the same emotional safety. They don't anticipate his needs the way you once did. They don't see him beyond the surface. And he realizes too late that you weren't common. You were familiar because you were invested. And investment is rare. This is when the regret sharpens, because now he knows the truth. If you were still emotionally available, he might not even feel this way. It's the loss of access that taught him your value. That's the paradox. He didn't appreciate you when you were accessible. He appreciates you now that you're not. And the most painful part, he knows it's his fault. Not because he was cruel, but because he was careless. Carelessness costs more than cruelty, because it destroys quietly. He understands now that you didn't leave to make a statement. You left because you recognized a pattern. You left because you were tired of offering depth to someone who only reached for it when it was convenient. You left because you chose yourself. And once a woman chooses herself fully, access is revoked permanently. That's the moment he realizes the mistake wasn't losing you. It was assuming you'd always be there to lose. And that realization stays with him, not as pain, as awareness, the kind that arrives too late to change the outcome, but early enough to haunt every comparison that follows. It doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives slowly, in fragments, in moments he didn't plan for. Usually when life quiets down enough that there's nowhere left to hide from his own thoughts. That's when he starts remembering you, not as you were at the end, tired and guarded, but as you were in the beginning, when loving him required faith more than proof. Back then, he didn't feel impressive. He was uncertain, still becoming, still wrestling with who he wanted to be. His dreams were louder than his results. His confidence came and went, and yet you showed up anyway. Not because he had everything figured out, but because you saw something forming beneath the surface. You believed before there was evidence. You invested when the return was uncertain. At the time, he didn't recognize that kind of love as rare. It felt comfortable, familiar, almost expected. He thought love looked like excitement, passion, constant affirmation. He didn't yet understand that real love often arrives quietly, offering stability instead of spectacle. So he received your devotion casually, without realizing how expensive it was for you to give it. You were there during the unfinished chapters, when he doubted himself, when his plans fell apart, when he needed encouragement more than admiration. You didn't wait for him to become someone else before standing beside him. You stood beside him while he was still learning how to stand at all. Psychologists often talk about supportive partner imprinting. Research shows that people form the strongest emotional bonds with those who stand by them during periods of low self-worth or transition, not during moments of success. Yet appreciation for that support often comes later, after growth has occurred. That delay is where regret is born. At the time, he was too close to the struggle to see the gift. He thought your patience meant you'd always have more. He thought your forgiveness meant there were no limits. He mistook your loyalty for permanence. Only later does he realize how much courage it took for you to love him when he wasn't easy to love. He remembers the small things now, how you celebrated progress others wouldn't notice, how you listened without interrupting, even when his fears sounded repetitive, how you defended him in rooms where he wasn't present, how you saw his potential as something already real, not something hypothetical. That kind of love isn't flashy. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand applause. It works quietly in the background, holding space while someone grows. And because it doesn't demand recognition, it often doesn't get it. He didn't know then that loving someone before they feel worthy of love requires a kind of emotional bravery. You were risking disappointment. You were risking being left behind if he outgrew the version of life you shared. You were risking loving someone who might never fully see you. But you did it anyway. Now, as time passes, he starts to understand the difference between being loved for who you are and being loved for what you provide. Back then, you weren't gaining anything tangible from loving him. No status, no security, no guarantees. You loved him simply because you cared, and that realization hits hardest when he notices how differently love shows up now. After you, attention feels conditional, support feels transactional, admiration comes with expectations. People are drawn to what he's become, not to who he was when he was unsure. And while that feels good on the surface, something inside him knows the difference. You loved him when he was still becoming. Others love him for what he became. And those two things are not the same. Studies on long-term relational satisfaction show that partners who supported each other through early adversity report deeper emotional bonds than those who met after success. Yet paradoxically, those early supporters are more likely to be undervalued in the moment, precisely because their love isn't tied to visible reward. That's the irony he lives with now. He remembers moments he once dismissed, times you encouraged him when he was ready to quit, times you believed in plans that hadn't worked yet, times you stayed calm while he was restless. You weren't trying to fix him. You were simply refusing to abandon him while he figured himself out. And he didn't protect that. He thought love was something that would wait until he had more to offer. He didn't realize love was already offering itself, asking only to be seen. There's a moment often triggered by failure when this realization deepens. When something doesn't go as planned, when confidence slips again, and the people around him don't know how to hold that version of him. They're not patient. They're not gentle. They weren't there for the climb, only the view. That's when he remembers you. How you didn't disappear when he felt small. How you didn't pressure him to perform. How you didn't make love conditional on success. He understands then that you didn't love him because he was impressive. You loved him because you were perceptive. You saw character before accomplishment, heart before results, effort before outcome. And that kind of vision is rare. He also realizes something else, something uncomfortable. Loving him the way you did cost you. It required emotional labor, reassurance, hope. You gave without knowing if he'd ever fully return it. And when he finally became more confident, more stable, more certain, you were already tired. Because love without reciprocity eventually becomes exhaustion. That truth lands heavily. He sees now that your leaving wasn't a lack of love. It was the result of loving too long without being met. You didn't stop caring. You stopped carrying the weight alone. And that's when the regret becomes personal. Not because he lost you, but because he lost someone who loved him at his most vulnerable. Someone who didn't wait for him to be worth it by the world's standards. Someone who saw worth when it wasn't obvious. He understands now that becoming worth loving in society's eyes often comes after someone has already done the hardest loving behind the scenes. And those people rarely get the credit they deserve. You didn't fall in love with a finished product. You fell in love with a process. And he didn't honor that process. As time moves on, this realization doesn't fade. It reshapes how he sees connection. He becomes more careful, more aware, because now he knows that the love that arrives early, when there's nothing to gain, is the love that matters most. And knowing what he lost stays with him, not as bitterness, but as understanding, the kind that comes only after the person who believed in you before you believed in yourself is no longer there to remind you how rare that belief was. It doesn't happen the first time he meets someone new. At first, it feels like movement, like progress, a sign that life goes on. He tells himself this is how it's supposed to work, that people move forward, that endings make space for beginnings. He sits across from someone new, listens, smiles, nods. On paper, everything looks right. She's attractive, she's kind, she's interested, and for a moment, he believes that this is enough. But something inside him stays quiet in the wrong way. He notices it in the pauses, in the spaces between words where something should land but doesn't. Conversation flows, yet it doesn't sink in. He laughs, but the laughter feels borrowed, like it belongs to the moment rather than to him. There's no tension, no depth pulling at him from underneath. Just surface level ease. He tells himself not to compare. That comparison is unfair. That every person deserves a clean slate, and he tries, he really does. But the mind doesn't ask permission before it remembers. She asks him how his day was, and he answers honestly, but without weight. With you, that same question used to open doors. You didn't just hear the words, you heard the meaning behind them. You knew when fine meant tired, when silence meant stress, when humor was hiding fear. With you, he didn't have to translate himself. Now he does. He starts noticing how much effort that takes. Psychologists describe this as emotional attunement, the ability to sense and respond to another person's internal state. Studies show that relationships with high emotional attunement create stronger bonds than those built on attraction or shared interests alone. And that's when it hits him. What he had with you wasn't just chemistry, it was resonance, and resonance is rare. He goes on more dates, different faces, different voices, different stories. Some are exciting, some are calm, some check all the boxes people talk about. But every time there's a moment, small, almost unnoticeable, when he waits for something that never arrives, a certain understanding, a familiar ease, a feeling of being seen without having to perform. With you, he never had to prove himself. With you, he never had to explain his silences. With you, he was allowed to just exist. Now he feels watched in a different way. Assessed, evaluated, even admired but not known. And admiration, he learns, is not the same as connection. He remembers how with you, vulnerability didn't feel like exposure. It felt like relief. You didn't rush to fix him. You didn't minimize what he felt. You sat with him in it. That kind of presence doesn't announce itself loudly, but its absence is deafening. The new woman doesn't do anything wrong. That's the hardest part. She's trying. She's showing up. She's being open. And that makes the realization even more uncomfortable, because it means the problem isn't her. It's the comparison he never wanted to make. He starts to notice how you linger in his memory during ordinary moments, when someone new reacts differently than you would have. When a joke lands flat instead of deep, when a disagreement feels tense instead of safe. With you, conflict didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a conversation, a bridge instead of a wall. Attachment research shows that people who have experienced emotionally secure relationships often struggle to settle into less attuned ones afterward. Once the nervous system learns what safety feels like, it recognizes its absence immediately. That's what's happening now. He realizes that with you, love wasn't loud, it was steady. It didn't spike and crash. It didn't rely on constant reassurance. It felt grounded. And now everything else feels slightly off balance, like furniture moved just a few inches from where it belongs. He remembers the way you anticipated him, not in a controlling way, but in a caring one. You knew when to give space and when to step closer. You didn't demand his energy, you respected it. And that respect made him want to give more, not less. Now, when someone new leans in too quickly or stays too distant, he feels it. The contrast is undeniable. He starts to understand something painful. What he had with you wasn't something that could be recreated on demand. It wasn't luck. It wasn't timing. It was the result of emotional investment, shared history, and mutual growth. Things that take time, things that can't be rushed or replaced. And suddenly, the idea of moving on feels simplistic, incomplete. He notices how often he thinks, she wouldn't have done it that way, or you would have understood. He doesn't want to be unfair, but memory doesn't operate on fairness. It operates on truth. And the truth is, you set a standard he didn't realize he was setting until now. That realization changes him. He becomes quieter, more reflective. He starts asking himself questions he avoided before. Why did he take your presence for granted? Why did he assume you'd always be there? Why did he wait until absence to recognize value? There's a particular moment that stays with him. Someone new reaches for him emotionally, and instead of feeling drawn closer, he feels tired, not because connection is exhausting, but because forced connection is. With you, effort felt natural. With others, it feels measured. That's when the regret sharpens. Not dramatic regret, not desperation, just a steady awareness that something rare passed through his life, and he didn't hold it with enough care. He realizes that what he misses isn't just you as a person, it's who he was with you. More open, more grounded, more himself. Research shows that the right partner doesn't just add to your life, they regulate your nervous system. They make you feel more like yourself, not less. And you did that. Now, as he sits across from someone new, he understands something he couldn't before. Love isn't about finding someone who looks right on paper. It's about finding someone who feels right in the quiet moments. Someone whose presence doesn't demand effort to maintain peace. He had that once. And meeting someone new didn't erase it. It revealed it. Every comparison, every subtle mismatch, every moment of emotional dissonance becomes a reminder. Not because you were perfect, but because what you shared was real, built, earned. That's when it finally hits him, not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, undeniable truth. You weren't just someone he loved, you were someone he learned from. And realizing that doesn't make him chase the past. It simply teaches him what can't be replaced. It takes time for this understanding to arrive, because at first, he tells himself a simpler story. He says you left because it got hard, because you were tired, because you couldn't handle the distance, the uncertainty, the waiting. That version of the story protects him. It keeps his ego intact. It lets him believe that if things had gone slightly differently, you would have stayed. But time has a way of stripping stories down to the truth. The truth shows up quietly in moments when he's forced to look back without defensiveness. When he notices how long you tried before you ever stopped. How many conversations you initiated. How often you explained instead of disappeared. How patient you were with patterns that never really changed. Strength, he realizes, wasn't something you discovered after you left. It was something you demonstrated every time you stayed longer than you should have. You didn't walk away impulsively. You walked away after exhausting every version of hope. At the beginning, he thought strength looked loud. He thought it meant arguments, ultimatums, demands. And because you weren't dramatic, because you didn't threaten to leave every time you were hurt, he underestimated you. He mistook your calm for tolerance, your understanding for permission, your loyalty for endurance without limits. But strong people don't announce their strength. They reveal it in restraint. You held space when it was uncomfortable. You stayed present when it would have been easier to shut down. You chose empathy even when you weren't receiving much in return. That wasn't weakness. That was discipline. That was emotional maturity. That was someone who knew how to love without losing themselves until the balance tipped too far. And when you finally left, it wasn't because you suddenly became strong. It was because you could no longer afford to be the only strong one. Psychological research on boundaries shows that people who leave long-term emotional imbalance aren't acting out of fragility, they're acting out of self-respect. It takes far more strength to walk away from what's familiar than to stay and tolerate what hurts, especially when there's still love involved. That's the part he didn't understand at first. He thought love should have been enough to keep you there. He didn't realize that love without safety slowly turns into self-abandonment, and you were no longer willing to abandon yourself to preserve something that wasn't meeting you halfway. When he replays the final months, he sees it differently now. He remembers how quiet you became, not distant but measured. How you stopped repeating yourself, how you listened more than you spoke. At the time, he thought things were settling down. He thought the absence of conflict meant peace. What it really meant was clarity. You were gathering yourself, not in anger, in resolve. People often assume that leaving is the hardest part. But for someone like you, the hardest part was staying as long as you did, while slowly realizing that love alone wasn't enough to sustain the relationship. Strength showed up in your patience. Strength showed up in your attempts to understand. Strength showed up in the way you tried to grow alongside him instead of ahead of him. Leaving was simply the final act of that strength. He understands now that you didn't leave to prove a point. You didn't leave to punish him. You didn't leave to show him what he lost. You left because staying was costing you pieces of yourself you couldn't replace. Studies on emotional burnout show that people who remain in one-sided relationships experience increased anxiety, lowered self-esteem, and emotional fatigue over time. The strongest ones don't collapse under that weight. They recognize it and step away before it destroys them. That was you. And realizing this changes how he sees the breakup entirely. It wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a moment of alignment. You chose congruence between what you felt and what you allowed. You chose integrity over attachment. You chose peace over potential. He starts to notice how different your departure was from others he's experienced. There was no chaos, no manipulation, no dramatic exit, just a calm firmness he couldn't argue with. At the time, that calm frustrated him. He wanted emotion he could react to. He wanted something he could fix or fight, but there was nothing to fight. You weren't leaving because you were overwhelmed. You were leaving because you were clear. And clarity is unshakable. He understands now that strength doesn't always look like persistence. Sometimes it looks like discernment, knowing when effort is no longer productive, knowing when love has turned into self-sacrifice, knowing when to stop explaining your needs to someone who keeps hearing them but not acting on them. You didn't leave because you stopped caring. You left because you cared enough about yourself to stop shrinking. That realization humbles him, because it means you weren't fragile, you weren't dependent, you weren't waiting for him to save you. You were choosing him every day until you chose yourself. And once that choice is made, it's not reversible. He starts to see your growth after the breakup, not as a reaction, but as a continuation. You didn't become confident because you left. You left because you had already become confident enough to know you deserved more. Your peace wasn't new. It was reclaimed. He notices how you didn't rush into proving anything. You didn't try to show how happy you were. You didn't seek validation for your decision. That quiet self-assurance speaks louder than any explanation ever could. Strong people don't need witnesses. Looking back, he recognizes the moments when you were testing reality, not him. You weren't asking for perfection. You were asking for consistency, presence, effort. And when those things didn't come, you didn't argue endlessly. You adjusted your expectations. And when adjusting became self-betrayal, you left. That's strength refined by wisdom. He understands now that your absence wasn't an escape. It was a boundary. And boundaries don't come from fear. They come from knowing exactly where you end and someone else begins. This realization doesn't arrive as guilt alone. It arrives as respect. A deep, quiet respect for the kind of woman who doesn't weaponize her strength, but lives by it. Who doesn't threaten to walk away, but does so when staying no longer aligns with who she is. And that understanding stays with him, because once you recognize that someone didn't leave you to be strong, but left because they already were, you can never tell yourself the story that they were too weak to stay. The truth is heavier than that. The truth is, you were strong enough to walk away from what you loved when it no longer loved you back in the way you needed. And that kind of strength doesn't disappear. It becomes the standard for everything that follows. It doesn't happen when he first misses you. Missing you is easy. Missing is emotional, temporary, and often selfish. It's rooted in absence, not understanding. He misses how you made him feel, how you softened his days, how your presence filled the quiet parts of his life. That comes early, that comes often, but that's not the final moment. The final moment arrives much later, when something inside him finally settles into clarity. At first, he believes in the safety of return. Even after time passes, even after distance grows, a part of him holds on to the idea that if he ever truly wanted to come back, you'd be there, maybe cautious, maybe hurt, but open, willing. He tells himself that history counts for something, that love leaves doors unlocked, that connection creates exceptions. This belief is comforting. It allows him to move through life without fully facing the weight of what he lost. Because as long as he thinks he could come back, the loss isn't complete. It's suspended, parked somewhere in the future where regret can be negotiated. He imagines conversations that haven't happened, apologies that would surely land, explanations you would finally understand. He imagines timing being the only problem, not choice. He imagines you as a constant, paused rather than gone, and for a while that illusion holds. But slowly reality begins to challenge it, not loudly, not all at once, in subtle ways that are impossible to ignore if he's honest with himself. He notices how you no longer check in, how mutual connections speak of you differently, as someone who has moved forward, not someone waiting. He sees the way your life has reshaped itself without reference to him. You are no longer orbiting the past. That's when unease sets in. He starts to realize that you're not protecting your heart anymore. You've healed it. And healed hearts don't reopen wounds for nostalgia. They don't revisit places that required too much explanation. They don't go backward to prove how much they once cared. Psychological research on post-relationship boundaries shows that when someone reaches emotional closure, their likelihood of reconciliation drops dramatically, not because love never existed, but because self-respect has taken root. Closure doesn't erase feeling, it reorders priorities. He begins to sense that if he showed up now, it wouldn't land the way he once imagined, that his words wouldn't have the same gravity, that his presence wouldn't disrupt your peace. And that realization is unsettling in a way missing you never was. Because now, the question isn't, do I want her back? It's, would she even choose me? He thinks back to who you were at the end, not angry, not pleading, just firm. He remembers how your voice didn't shake when you said you were done, how you didn't over-explain, how you didn't ask him to convince you otherwise. At the time, he thought you were bluffing, or protecting yourself, or acting out of emotion. He didn't understand that what he was seeing was acceptance. Acceptance doesn't negotiate. Acceptance doesn't threaten. Acceptance doesn't wait. And once someone reaches it, there's no version of the past powerful enough to pull them back. That's when the final moment begins to take shape. He imagines reaching out now, not impulsively, but thoughtfully. He imagines saying all the things he didn't say before, taking responsibility in ways he avoided, showing up differently. And for the first time, he realizes something painful. Even if he did all of that, it wouldn't change the outcome. Because the version of you who needed those words doesn't exist anymore. You needed effort when it mattered, presence when it was inconvenient, consistency when it wasn't exciting. You needed him to choose you before losing you taught him how, and that window closed quietly. Studies on relational timing show that reconciliation is least likely when one partner experiences significant personal growth after a breakup. Growth creates distance, not emotional distance, but identity distance. When someone becomes more aligned with themselves, they are less willing to return to dynamics that required self-abandonment. That's what he senses now. You're not holding out. You're not testing him. You're not waiting to see if he's changed. You've already changed enough to know what you won't accept again. And that realization lands heavy, because it means the loss is no longer theoretical. It's final. Not because you hate him, not because you're cold, but because you're clear. He understands now that love isn't always enough to reopen a door once someone has walked through it with intention. Love can exist alongside boundaries. Affection can exist without access. Memory can exist without permission to return. And that's what breaks the last illusion. He sees you differently now, not as someone he could win back, but as someone who chose herself without apology, someone who didn't need closure from him because she gave it to herself, someone who didn't leave to be chased, but to be free. He realizes that if he stood in front of you today, whole and honest and regretful, you wouldn't collapse into old feelings. You would listen, maybe even understand, but you wouldn't go back, because you know what going back would cost. That's when regret transforms into something deeper than sadness. It becomes respect mixed with loss, admiration mixed with grief, the understanding that the woman who once would have fought for the relationship is no longer available to fight with. She's done fighting. He sees now that your refusal wouldn't be dramatic. It would be calm, gentle, final. You wouldn't punish him with anger. You wouldn't reopen wounds. You would simply decline. And there is nothing more humbling than realizing you no longer have a place in someone's future, not because you weren't loved, but because they loved themselves more. This is the moment that stays with him. Not the breakup, not the arguments, not the silence afterward, but the knowing that you wouldn't take him back even if he finally understood everything, even if he finally became everything you once asked for, because you're no longer the woman who waits for potential to turn into action. You are the woman who chooses reality, and that choice is irreversible. He understands now that what makes this moment final isn't rejection, it's timing. He arrived at clarity after you arrived at peace, and peace doesn't trade itself for familiarity. He doesn't feel anger toward you. He feels something quieter and more enduring. Gratitude mixed with regret, because knowing someone like you existed in his life changed him, and knowing he can't return changed him even more. This realization becomes a mirror. It forces him to confront how easily love can be taken for granted when it feels secure, how quickly patience is mistaken for permanence, how often people assume tomorrow will offer another chance. You are his chance. And the final moment is not when he wants you back. It's when he understands that you would never go back to him. And in that understanding, everything becomes clear. A woman like you doesn't scream her value. She walks away from situations that no longer honor it. And when a man finally realizes what he lost, it's not because you reminded him. It's because your absence taught him. You were never replaceable. You were rare timing, and he missed it. Once in a lifetime, mistakes don't announce themselves when they happen. They reveal themselves when it's too late.